Edgar Stoll was the editor of the South Bend Times in 1905, a Democratic paper in a Republican town, an underdog publication for as long as it had existed. Stoll had made a career of poaching subscribers wherever and however he could find them. He did the same thing with writers too, and that's how he found himself, in autumn of 1905, alighting the doorstep of a home that had already been standing for 50 years and is still standing today. Stoll was looking for a man named Rex, a writer from the Niles Daily Sun. Stoll had been impressed with the man's work and wanted to hire him away from the Michigan outfit he was associated with. As luck would have it, Rex wasn't home that day, but Rex's unemployed brother was. Rex's brother entertained the guest and boasted of his own ability to write up the news, a claim that was at best an exaggeration and at worst an outright lie. Rex's brother had never worked a journalistic beat a day in his life, had never thought a thought about becoming a newspaper man until the man on his doorstep announced that he was desperate to hire one. Either because he was impressed by the young man's ability to invent spontaneous fiction, or because he believed it, Edgar Stoll hired Rex's brother for the job he'd wanted Rex for in the first place. It was a Thursday afternoon when Stoll left the home to make the long trek back to South Bend. His newest hire would start at the office on Monday. Edgar Stoll barely had any idea who he'd just hired, and he had even less of an idea who the man would become. Rex's brother was named Ring Lardner, and he was about to write his first newspaper story for the South Bend Times. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series, we're diving into some of the fun and forgotten businesses of South Bend, running the gamut from toys to bait to underwear to newspapers. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of the entire series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump into the South Bend News Times, an underdog story that features some of the brightest journalistic stars in these United States, all of them getting their start right here in South Bend. But before we get to them, we have to go all the way back to the 1840s, more than 20 years before South Bend even became a city. There wasn't much money in newspapers at this time, just as it seems there isn't much money in newspapers now. That's why virtually all the newspapers in print were openly partisan in nature. At that time, towns had a Whig paper and a Democratic paper. Republican papers would replace the Whig papers soon enough. The purpose of most early newspapers wasn't to make money for its owners. It was to further a political agenda. Papers were still required to report on the news of the day if they wanted subscribers, but in return, most editors would spin political stories however they needed to in order to serve their narrative. Schuyler Colfax began his own political ascent when he acquired ownership of the Whig paper, the South Bend Free Press, and immediately changed its name to the St. Joseph Valley Register. It was a shrewd political move more than a profit-minded one, and helped to bolster Colfax's reputation and notoriety among the electorate who would eventually vote him into the House of Representatives. But we're not here to discuss Whig newspapers. We're here to discuss the Democratic papers, the underdogs that eventually brought the News Times to South Bend, a long chain of events that begins with the founding of the St. Joseph County Forum, all the way back in 1853 by father and son Ariel Lucius Drapier and William H. Drapier. The elder Drapier was known for writing the strongest editorials that had ever appeared in the county, but never parlayed his fame into office within the ardently Republican region. With the understanding that early newspapers were often used by political hopefuls as a way of getting their foot in the door and putting their name in front of the public, It makes sense why South Bend's Democratic papers had such itinerant editorial runs throughout the 1800s. In short, the strategy wasn't working. Democrats weren't getting elected, and while no one got in the local news business to make money, they were losing an awful lot more than they'd hoped for on a political lark that was proving fruitless. Or maybe it was the forced suppression of the Forum during the Civil War that drove the Drapiers from the business. The paper was censored at least once during the conflict for improper utterances and then sold before the war's end. The new buyer was Edward Malloy, a returning Civil War veteran who immediately changed the name of the publication to the South Bend Weekly Union, an attempt to establish his venture as firmly loyal while distancing itself from the stain of the rumors of its past. Malloy was a staunch Republican and ran his version of the paper as such for the next 6 years before moving to LaPorte, where he would become the editor of the LaPorte Herald for the next 40 years. With Malloy out of the picture, the Weekly Union was sold to Charles Murray in 1864, who renamed the thing all over again and restored democratic politics to his freshly christened South Bend Herald, then put his son Charles T. Murray in the editor's seat. The Herald began to print daily, the first Democratic paper to do so. But in a city that had presented plenty of hurdles to Democratic paper editors, there was about to be another one. It wasn't bad enough that the publications were losing money without delivering any of the political power that its pensmen so desperately sought. Now, it was about to turn deadly. Less than a year after taking over the paper, in an episode that requires so much more time than I have to give it, and that absolutely deserves its own deep dive, Charles T. Murray, the editor of the Democratic paper, was shot outside his office by the son of the Republican sheriff. The story's more complicated than all of that, way more complicated than all of that, and we don't have time for the whole thing right now, but just know that this was about the biggest scandal in South Bend at the time, and it was about to get even worse. While his family gathered round his bed and waited for Murray to die, a friend from Chicago named James McDermott arrived in town to take temporary charge of the Herald, making sure that the paper wasn't silenced and was issued as scheduled the next day. 3 days after he arrived in South Bend to run the Herald, there was an attempt on McDermott's life that left him beaten and bloody with a handful of broken ribs. Miraculously, neither man died, and maybe more miraculously, both returned to the newspaper business despite their harrowing experiences. After the violence and the near-death experience, the Murrays remained in the newspaper business another 6 years before selling the Herald to Henry Peed in 1881. Peed renamed the outfit the South Bend Times and sat in the editor's seat for just 2 years before he decided he wanted out of the business, claiming that the city's Democratic bosses were exercising an undue influence on his ability to run the paper. There was turmoil in South Bend's Democratic journalistic circles that extended beyond the times when its editors were getting shot at. During the 1880s, 3 more Democratic papers would begin publication in the city: the South Bend News, the South Bend Post, and the New Era. 4 competing Democratic papers. How does that happen? Well, it certainly wasn't a product of supply and demand. South Bend at this time had a population of about 15,000, and about half of them were Democrats. What's more, a not insignificant number of those Democrats were recent immigrants who chose newspapers written in their native tongues. Truth was, there was barely a viable market for one of those papers, let alone 4. Then, if it wasn't motivated by money, it must have been politics. The leadership of South Bend's Democratic Party during the 1880s was insular, protected, and largely appointed by party bosses, at least to hear the Republican Tribune tell it. The Post and the News were launched because those editors didn't want to have to wait their turn to get their voices heard among the city's Democratic elite. As for the New Era, it was the paper of the Greenback Party, a Democratic offshoot with a political agenda different enough to warrant its own publication in the city. But the new era didn't last long, ending its run in 1883 when the Greenback Party fizzled. As for the other papers, they weren't around for long, a result of lost money and failed political ambition. The Post closed in 1903. The News and the Times agreed to a merger, publishing for a few years as separate papers from the same office building, and then marrying their operations completely in 1913, running the first issue of the South Bend News-Times imprint on July 1st, 1913. We'll take a look at that first issue right after the break.
The Indiana and Michigan Electric Company is extending their special whole house wiring sale for the month of May 1910. $14 wires a 4-room house, $21 wires a 6-room house, and $29 wires an 8-room house. You will certainly wire sometime, why not now? Cost includes fixtures and lamps ready to light. Call on the Indiana and Michigan Electric Company at number 462 or visit the offices at 220 West Colfax Avenue. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
The first issue of the newly formed South Bend News-Times doesn't feel like a time capsule as much as you think it should. The lead stories on the front page tell of an oppressive heat wave that's rocked the city, with temperatures soaring into the upper 90s. There's an article on that front page about the tragic death of a 4-year-old, shot accidentally by a 10-year-old with a gun. The first issue also reported on the closing of South Bend's Leaper Park Zoo, taught women how to make ice cream, relayed the heroics of the Chicago Cubs during a 12-2 victory over the Pittsburgh Pirates, and ran the obituary of Father Valentine Krzyzewski, probably the most important figure in South Bend's early Polish history. The paper was very good, and its local coverage was at least as good, if not better than, the South Bend Tribune. The News-Times made a number of early strategic moves that paid off better than could have been expected. It ran an entire section on news of interest to Polish citizens, just as second-generation English-reading Poles graduated into adulthood. It became an early sponsor of the National Spelling Bee just in time for South Bend girl Betty Robinson to win the national competition, correctly spelling albumen, a word that refers to the protein of an egg white. But mostly, the paper took chances on unknown and unproven writers, and in almost every case, those chances paid off. There was Ring Lardner, the News-Times, his first stop on a meteoric rise that would see him syndicated in more than 100 papers, win half a vote at the 1924 Democratic Convention, write critically acclaimed Broadway plays, and become Holden Caulfield's second favorite author. Lardner was only at the News-Times for a few brief years, but his trademark wit and humor came through during a Sporting Year in Review column in which he wrote, "Looking back over the past year, local followers of sport have 3 things to be thankful for. There were no fake fights pulled off in our midst. The high school football team went through the season with no deaths and only 1 defeat. And the South Bend Ball Club did not run absolutely last." But the list of impressive writers didn't nearly end with Lardner. The newsroom once included Charles Butterworth, a man who would later move on to the New York Times, onto vaudeville and Broadway, onto the silver screen, and eventually onto the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Butterworth was a bona fide star with more than 30 film credits to his name, including a starring role alongside Clark Gable in Forsaking All Others. Despite his otherwise serious expression, Butterworth's wheelhouse was deadpan comedy. Unlike other actors who freely dealt in over-the-top cheese, Butterworth's delivery was more subtle, occasionally tilting toward the kind of anti-comedy that would still play well today. It was a popular but sometimes divisive shtick, earning either praise or derision from New York Times columnist Alma Whitaker, who called Butterworth a professional silly ass. Butterworth's old cohorts at the News-Times would have likely agreed with the assessment. When the young reporter played a prank on his bosses by fictitiously reporting the death of a prominent South Bend citizen, the paper fired him from his duties. It's uncertain whether the obituary actually ran, or if the joke was caught before the paper went to press. Either way, I spent way too long in the microfilm trying to find it. The paper's list of writers keeps going. It was a deep bullpen indeed. John Streibel started his career as a newspaper hawker, selling papers at storefronts and street corners, purchasing a soda with his earnings, then returning to the basement at the News-Times to talk baseball with the other newspaper boys. Once, during a particularly boring day, Streibel deigned to entertain the squad by drawing a caricature of the circulation manager on a newly whitewashed basement wall. It didn't take long before Streibel's handiwork was discovered, and not much longer after that before one of his cohorts ratted the artist out. John Streibel was summoned straight away to the editor's office. He came for a scolding he knew he deserved, and apologized profusely and preemptively for mocking his boss. Edgar Stoll wouldn't hear it. In 1905, at the same time he was taking a chance on Ring Lardner, Stoll was making another non-traditional hire, bringing on board a 14-year-old newspaper boy as his head political cartoonist, based entirely on a piece of basement graffiti that was never supposed to be discovered. In the blink of an eye, John Streibel had been transformed from a newspaper boy into the youngest political commentator in the nation. The former newspaper boy was well respected during his early career at the News-Times, and he remained accountable to his superiors and his deadlines. Despite his lack of formal art training, his style was not crude. Despite his age, his commentary was shrewd and insightful. Despite his experience, his countenance was professional and impressive. Streibel was even known to jump in and cover actual news stories as a reporter when the paper was short-handed. Besides all of that, the boy was as strict in his personal affairs as he was at work, saving his pay so that he could attend college at Notre Dame. He maintained his work at the News-Times throughout his schooling and became fast friends with a classmate and co-worker named J.P. McAvoy. McAvoy was a New York orphan adopted by Irish academics, then moved to South Bend and enrolled at Notre Dame. That's where he met Streibel and how he came to be a junior sports reporter at the South Bend News-Times. The writing came easy for McAvoy, but sports did not. His first assignment was to cover a local baseball game, and McAvoy became so preoccupied with wordsmithing the descriptions of the action on the field that he forgot to record or recall the score of the game, nor make mention of who won the contest. But there was a glimmer of something impressive in the boy's writing, and the News-Times invested in developing the talent it saw in him. McAvoy went on to write nationally syndicated weekly serials, author books, and write plays. He collaborated with John Streibel to create the comic strip Dixie Dugan, one of the most successful and longest-lasting strips of its time. McAvoy followed in the steps of Ring Lardner, writing films for Shirley Temple and penning a varietal Broadway musical called Americana. Americana featured compositions by George Gershwin and Broadway stars like Lou Bryce and Roy Atwell. But it was a Broadway newcomer who stole the show, gaining the biggest laughs from audiences night after night. The critics agreed with the crowd's assessments, writing that the utterly unknown figure was the funniest performer and that they could not recall such an inexperienced player making such an impression. The man they were talking about and laughing with was Charles Butterworth. It was a deep bullpen indeed, but it wasn't to last. After the break, the downfall of the South Bend News-Times.
If you're looking for a safe-performing, serviceable used car, look no further than L.O. Gates. With used Chevrolets starting at just $139 and more than 70 used cars of equal value to choose from, your next ride is waiting for you at L.O. Gates at 202 Lincoln Way East. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
By the middle of the 1930s, South Bend was at least as much a Democratic city as it was a Republican one. The Democrats weren't the underdog party anymore, and so the News-Times shouldn't have been the underdog paper. But it was, and it had nothing to do with politics, nothing at all to do with the strength of its local reporting, an arena in which the South Bend News-Times had consistently outperformed its rival. But beginning with the outset of World War I, through the Great Depression, and into the run-up toward the ascension of Nazis in Germany, readers became increasingly more interested in national and international affairs, and when it came to the news of the world, the News-Times was in a clear second place. The South Bend Tribune had established an exclusive syndication deal with the Associated Press before 1895, gaining them an impressive collection of national journalists including Will Rogers, Grantland Rice, and even Ring Lardner. The News-Times had syndication deals with the United Press and with the International News Service. The News-Times paid less in fees for both of those outlets than the Tribune paid for its relationship with the AP, but the News-Times got what it paid for. In 1924, when Notre Dame marched into the Polo Grounds for the most anticipated matchup of the football season against a vaunted Army squad, readers of the Tribune got the write-up of the game from Grantland Rice, a legendary sports writer, producing the most legendary words ever written about the sport. Outlined against a blue-gray October sky, the four horsemen rode again. In dramatic lore, they are known as famine, pestilence, destruction, and death. These are only aliases. Their real names are Struldrer, Miller, Crowley, and Layden. They formed the crest of the South Bend Cyclone, before which another Fighting Army football team was swept over the precipice at the Polo Grounds yesterday afternoon, as 55,000 spectators peered down on the bewildering panorama spread on the green plain below. But readers of the News-Times didn't get that. Instead, they got a write-up from Westbrook Pegler, a guy no one has ever heard of, writing a set of words that everyone would forget as soon as they read them. The impudent Irish of Notre Dame University continued their insulting behavior toward the best football traditions of the East, rolling up another victory over the Army Saturday afternoon without seeming to exert themselves unduly. The score was 13-7. Notre Dame scored 2 touchdowns, but missed 1 goal. Being the editor of the News-Times throughout the 1920s and 1930s must have been an awful experience, knowing that your national and international coverage is lacking, but also knowing that there is nothing you can do about it. Even worse, all of the wonderful and incredible writers who'd passed through the News-Times went on to illustrious careers and syndication deals with the Associated Press. By 1925, you didn't just need a Tribune subscription to read the best writers in America. You also needed a Tribune subscription to read the best writers South Bend had ever produced. In the years before the Great Depression, newspaper subscription rates climbed to 120% in South Bend. In other words, there were 20% more newspaper subscriptions in South Bend than there were households, meaning that there were a lot more people with subscriptions to multiple papers than had no subscriptions at all. But in almost every case, it was the News-Times that was the second subscription, not the first one. You needed a Tribune subscription to read the best and latest from around the world, regardless of your political affiliation. You needed the News-Times if you wanted your local coverage to be filtered first through a Democrat's sieve. And of course, if things were bad before the Great Depression, they got a lot worse after. The Tribune made a strategic effort to cover local politics in a less biased, less partisan way. It would be a while before it tried to do it in a non-biased, non-partisan way, but it was on a path, and it was headed that way. It meant that a Democrat might not agree with everything the Tribune wrote, but at least he could read it without flinging the paper into the fire. During the Depression, when everyone was pinching as many pennies as they could, the News-Times became superfluous. 1930 was the last year that the South Bend News-Times covered its own costs, and published at a growing loss for the next 8 years. The South Bend News-Times went out of business on December 27, 1938. The last issue ran a simple headline, the number 30. In the newspaper profession, 30 means the end. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks to Andy and Tina Nickel for underwriting this episode and each episode in this series. Our next episode will cover Birdcell Manufacturing Company, maker of the Birdcell Clover Huller. I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.